Before we get into the lecture, I'm just going to take a couple minutes, few moments to introduce myself. I'm Michael J. Alexander. I did my undergraduate work at Vanderbilt University down in Nashville, Tennessee, way back in the late 90s. But I only spent 3 years on campus at Vanderbilt because my junior year, I did a year abroad in Bologna, Italy. And even if you're tangentially thinking about doing study abroad, do it. It's the best experience you'll ever have, bar none. Even if it's just for a few weeks over the summer, it'll be a transformative experience. I would not be where I am today were it not for that time in Bologna. That time in Bologna led me to pursue graduate studies, to get my master's, my PhD, University of Virginia, down in Charlottesville, Virginia. But once again, I didn't spend my entire time on campus. I had a Fulbright research year to do my dissertation, archival work in Padua, Italy. Small town, about half an hour from Venice. Beautiful, wonderful, highly recommend it. Since 2007, I have been here at Virginia Tech, teaching a wide variety of history courses from the ancient world right through to modernity and absolutely everything in between. So that's me. Let's get on with the lecture. This is a lecture that's about a relatively short period of time. Really, although the dates up there are 1917 to 1939, it's really more about the 1920s into the very beginning of the 1930s, prior to the presidency of Franklin Roosevelt and prior to the chancellorship and then dictatorship of Adolf Hitler, something you'll be talking about in class next week. And in order to understand what happens here in the years after the First World War, we have to go back to the Industrial Revolution. You've seen how, first in England, and then spreading throughout Europe and across the Atlantic to America, the Industrial Revolution created a massive amount of wealth via factories. It gave the textile mills in England. The world changed dramatically. But there was a lot of exploitation in these factories. A lot of exploitation. And in the middle of the 19th century, a German philosopher named Karl Marx, along with his partner Friedrich Engels, wrote easily for word count and number of pages the most influential treatise of the 19th century and maybe of the modern world, the Manifesto of the Communist Party. Now you've got a brief excerpt from that manifesto, but it can really be summed up in one concept: haves and have-nots. Factory owners, what Marx calls the bourgeoisie, literally it comes from the French word for city, urbanites, and the proletariat, the people who worked in those factories. And as Marx writes, the history of all hitherto existing societies is the history of class struggles. Freeman and slave, patrician and plebeian, lord and serf, guildmaster and journeyman, in a word, oppressor and oppressed. So what I want you to do now is to pause this video and read the excerpts from the Communist Manifesto. What does Marx prescribe for the future? And what does he mean by workers of the world unite? Okay. Pause the video, read that, with an eye towards these questions. All right. The full manifesto is only about 30, 40 pages long. It's very short. Some of it gets very pointless and dry. I've given you the good stuff, ending with that list of prescriptions for how to have a communist state. Second piece of primary source evidence that speaks to this gulf between the workers and the owners. It's a piece of music. It was written in France around the year 1870. It's called the Internationale. And it's called the Internationale because of what Marx had argued back in the Communist Manifesto. That workers in Germany, workers in England, workers in America had more in common with each other than they did with the factory owners. Okay? That they needed to form an international brotherhood and rise up and destroy those who are oppressing them. So you have some very evocative lyrics in this song. Damned to the earth, prisoners of hunger, army of slaves, arise! This is the final struggle. Let's gather, and tomorrow the Internationale will be mankind. So once again, pause the video, read these lyrics to this song with an eye towards class struggle, class antagonism. It's a thing that Karl Marx was writing about in 1848. It's the same thing that's happening here in the lyrics to this song. This becomes the International Workers' Anthem and will actually become the anthem of the Soviet Union. This is a hugely influential and very commonly known song, translated into a whole multitude of languages. So pause the tape and read these lyrics with an eye towards class struggle. Okay, welcome back. What I want to show you now is a piece of film that's primary source evidence, and I should point out, should have pointed out already, that my lectures are color-coded. You might have noticed that the title Communist Manifesto was in blue. You might have noticed that the title The Internationale was in blue, and the lyrics were in blue. That's not an accident, that's not an aesthetic choice. In my course, every piece of primary source evidence, those things that historians use to understand the past, I always put them in blue. This is a fascinating piece of primary source evidence. This is a movie. It's a German movie, a silent movie, which means there's no dialogue, but there is music. It's a movie called Metropolis. It's done by Fritz Lang back in 1927. So just 9 years after the end of World War I. And it's about a future society that has completely bifurcated into workers and owners. It's kind of the future prophesied by Karl Marx back in the mid-19th century. So what we're going to see here is this bifurcated society with the workers who have built the city literally living below the ground, and the owners, the capitalists, living up amongst the clouds. These, as you might have guessed, are not the factory owners, these are the workers, trudging from the factory down to the elevators, which will take them to their subterranean home. It's a very grim picture of the future, of society completely divided. As deep below as high above, the club of the suns, where all is delight, pleasure, and sport, free from the cares of working. These are the children of the owners. chief industrialist here, whose office is high atop what the movie calls the New Tower of Babel, with his army of white-collar workers and the stock tickers in the background. There they are, the stock tickers. And here comes the great industrialist's son, who's just gone below, accidentally, to the world of the workers. He's horrified by what he's seen. Factory owner, the chief industrialist here. What if one day those in the depths rise up against you? This is 1927. Exactly a decade earlier, a man named Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov had brought into being Karl Marx's vision of a communist revolution. Now you know who Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov is. You might not know him by that name. You probably know him by his revolutionary name, his nom de guerre, Lenin. In October 1917, in the chaos of a faltering war, the Russian autocrat Nicholas II's reign collapses. It's replaced by a provisional government which continues to prosecute an amazingly unpopular war against Germany. And in the fall of that year, 1917, Lenin returns from exile on a German train and foments a communist revolution, a Bolshevik revolution. Bolshevik's the name of his party, which literally means the majoritarians, even though they were far from a majority of anything. And Lenin talks a good Marxist game. Phrases like ownership of the factories to the workers, land to the peasants, and perhaps most importantly in this cauldron of war, peace to the army. Russia will devolve into a bloody civil war between the Bolsheviks and the monarchists, a civil war that will be won by the Bolsheviks and Lenin. But Lenin's not long for the world. In 1924, he dies. And this is what he looks like today. If you go to Red Square in Moscow, you can see the embalmed, preserved body of Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov. Upon his death, a man from the backwoods, from the Republic of Georgia, way down in the Caucasus, Joseph Dugashvili, takes over. But you don't know him as Joseph Dugashvili. You know him as Joseph Stalin. Stalin means man of steel. And he's kind of a Janus-faced figure. On the one hand, you get all this propaganda of the great father of the Russian people, the beloved leader. This is the outward propaganda. The reality, though, is that among dictators of the 20th century, no one is bloodier than Joseph Stalin. He maintains power through terror. Concept pioneered by Lenin, perfected by Joseph Stalin. His secret police, the NKVD, which will later become the KGB, makes hundreds of thousands of people simply disappear. He will regularly purge the army and the political class of people who he, in his paranoid delusions, believes are plotting against him. Images like this become very common. People are literally washed out of photographs. They disappear. It's as if they never existed. And many, many more will end up in the wasteland of Siberia, in the gulags, in the prison camps, where many, many, many will die. It's estimated that in his nearly 3 decades in power, from 1924 to 1953, that Joseph Stalin killed at least 15 million of his fellow Russians. 15 million. That's twice the population of New York City. The Soviet Union is a dangerous place to be in the 1920s and 1930s. But in the Western world, in America and in Western Europe, the 1920s is a boom time. We call it the Roaring 20s. Jazz is born, it comes of age, moving from the South up to the great northern cities of Chicago and New York. The president is Silent Cal, Calvin Coolidge, who takes over when his boss, Warren Harding, dies in 1923, wins re-election in 1924. His famous quote, "The business of America is business." Now, we've got excerpts from 2 speeches by Calvin Coolidge. I want you to pause the tape now and read these 2 speeches. What kind of vision of the world, politically and economically, is Calvin Coolidge selling here? One in his inaugural address from March 1925, and the second a speech to the New York City Chamber of Commerce in November 1925. Compare that to Karl Marx's vision, and that espoused by the Internationale. So pause the tape, read these 2 speech excerpts. Okay. The world that Cal presides over is changing rapidly. Women have gotten the vote in 1920. Social mores that had really hemmed women in are being relaxed and challenged here in the 1920s. The image of the flapper becomes a kind of icon of women's liberation in the years after the war. And we've got 2 pieces of primary source evidence that speak to this rapidly socially changing world. One is written in 1921 by Anshaw Faulkner, published in the Ladies' Home Journal. "Does Jazz Put the Sin in Syncopation?" Very punny title. The second is written a year later, December 1922, published in the magazine Outlook by Ellen Wells Page, entitled "A Flapper's Appeal to Parents." So, once again, pause the tape. Read. What should you read first? Read the 1921 article first. They're both very short, page long. Read Anshaw Faulkner's article, then read Ellen Wells Page's rebuttal, in many ways, to this old view. So times are good here in the 1920s. Jazz music has swept the nation and been exported to Europe and places beyond. In in jazz clubs like the Cotton Club, famous Cotton Club in Harlem. People like Duke Ellington are becoming celebrities. And in the midst of all this exuberance, the stock market is on a tear. There's no other way to put it. This chart shows the growth of $100 invested in the summer of 1926 in the stock market. By 1929, that $100 has tripled in value. No era in American history has seen this kind of prosperity. It's not going to last. What I'm going to show you now is a clip from a PBS documentary done in the 1990s about the stock market of the 1920s and the set of circumstances that helps to explain why it imploded in October of 1929. This is to introduce a theory called the second voice. The second voice pedagogical theory says that if you hear me say everything, it's not as effective as if we bring in outside experts. Think of how a good documentary is done. You've got a narrator, and then they introduce experts A, B, and C, and they give their take. Well, that's what we're going to do here with this clip from PBS on the irrational exuberance, the stock market, the 1920s.
What will they think of next was a 1920s saying. This new things were continually coming out, and there were new things which you could enjoy, not just for the few.
One of the most wondrous inventions of the age was consumer credit. Before 1920, the average worker couldn't borrow money. By 1929, buy now, pay later had become a way of life. But the market had entered popular culture. Wall Street became Main Street. Everyone was talking stocks. Watching the ticker became a national sport. Popular magazines covered financial news. Dozens of bestsellers promised investors the inside track.
Oh, what a feeling, you got me feeling bigger and better.
With record numbers of smaller investors, was borrowing money to buy stocks. It was called buying on margin. You only needed 10% down. Just $1,000 would get you $10,000 worth of stock. Suddenly you were in the same league with the big players, or so it seemed. But the stock market was not a level playing field.
In the 20s and 30s, one of the big features of the stock market is the fact that it wasn't controlled, and that operators could do a lot of things that are not permitted today.
One of the most common tactics was to manipulate the price of a particular stock. A stock like Radio Corporation of America. Wealthy investors would pool their money in a secret agreement to buy a stock, inflate its price, and then sell it to an unsuspecting public. Most stocks in the 1920s were regularly manipulated by insiders.
I would say that practically all the financial journals were on take. This includes reports of the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Herald Tribune, you name it. So if you were a pool operator, you'd call your friend at the Times and say, look, Charlie, there's an envelope waiting for you here, and we think that perhaps you should write something nice about RCA. Now, if they are behind it, you want to join them. So you buy stock also. And what's happening is the stock goes from 10 to 15 to 20, and now it's at 20 and you start buying. Other people start buying, 30, 40. The original group, the pool, they stop buying. They're selling you the stock. Now 50, and they're out of it. And what happens, of course, is the stock collapses.
Wall Street had its critics, among them economist Roger Babson. He questioned the boom and was accused of lack of patriotism, of selling America short.
Roger Babson warned of the speculation, said there's going to be a crash, and the aftermath is going to be quite terrible.
March 4th, Inauguration Day. Republican President Calvin Coolidge had run his administration on the belief that business was the basis of America's prosperity. Government should not interfere. Herbert Hoover had won a landslide victory promising to carry on the tradition.
This was a time in our history when governments did not, as now, take responsibility for the economy. They presided over it, but the level of economic activity and the level of economic growth and the stability of prices were not yet everyday concerns of the president.
Everybody thought it would just keep going up and up and up, that there was no limit to the stock market. But there was a limit. And in October 1929, it happened. The bottom fell out of the market. That $100 that had become $300 was now worth $50 by the lowest point. But you had been spending like you had those $300. You had been buying stock on margin. Millions are ruined. The American economy collapses. Here's a chart tracking unemployment. Begins in 1929, goes right up through the war years, the early 1940s. Unemployment before the crash had been incredibly low, less than 5%. Less than half of what it is today. By 1932, the year that Franklin Roosevelt is elected, unemployment is up to 25%. An utter and complete disaster. Slow recovery during the 1930s in the Roosevelt administration, a recovery that is massively accelerated by the Second World War. If we look across the Atlantic to Europe, England had not enjoyed an economic boom on the level that America had during the 1920s, and consequently has a less severe time of it, the Great Depression. Nonetheless, by 1932, unemployment in the United Kingdom is well above 20%. Although it had started off at a much worse place, in excess of 10% before 1929. This is a result of the First World War and the economic costs incurred by England in that war. Even harder hit than America is Germany. The loser of the First World War, shackled with massive reparations as a result of the Treaty of Versailles. Unemployment in Germany literally goes off the chart. 30% unemployment by the election of 1932, an election that will see Adolf Hitler's National Socialist German Workers' Party, better known as the Nazis, capture 37% of the vote. This is what you're going to be talking about in class next week, the rise of totalitarian Nazism in Germany. In 1928, as you're going to see, the Nazis campaigned on a platform to abolish the Treaty of Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles was universally hated in Germany, but it was not an electorally winning message. Just 3% of the vote was given to the Nazis in 1928. But the economic collapse, beginning in America, will give the Nazis a new political message. Arbeit und Brot. Work and bread. And it will prove to be a powerful electoral message. So what we're going to do in class on Friday is we're going to be doing some debating, some comparing and contrasting with primary source evidence. On the one hand, we've got communist writings, Marx's Communist Manifesto and the lyrics to the Internationale. On the other side of the equation, we have excerpts from the two speeches by Calvin Coolidge in 1925. We're going to have a little debate between capitalism and communism, and we're also going to have a debate between old and new. The radically changing social life of the 1920s via Anshaw Faulkner's Does Jazz Put the Sin in Syncopation versus Ellen Wells Page, A Flapper's Appeal to Parents. So make sure you've read these, take notes on them. We're going to have a little bit of a debate between communism and capitalism, between the old ways and the new ways of the 1920s. Look forward to working with you very closely with these important pieces of primary source evidence on Friday. Thank you.